Welcome back to the Social Impact Level Up podcast. This is where we blur the lines between business, nonprofit, and impact. I'm your host, Wendy V, and I'm a social impact strategist here to help you build a successful and sustainable legacy of social change. In this week's episode, we're going to hear from a social entrepreneur who has been on a journey to change the world just like you. If you are interested in social entrepreneurship, this is the place for you. Let's jump right into this week's episode. Welcome, everyone, to the Social Impact Level Up podcast. I'm Wendy V, and I'm your host for this episode. We are going to talk to Lori Marks, who is someone that I met through a close friend who introduced me into more nonprofit founders. And I really wanted to understand what Lori's vision was for connecting multi-generations into just what I consider more of a mentoring, supportive relationship, mutually supportive relationship. And we'll hear all about this and what her idea was and how she came to put it into action. So, Lori, I just wanted to invite you to quickly introduce yourself and tell people more about you.
Well, thank you, Wendy, and thank you so much for having me on your social impact podcast today. It's really great to be here. So I'm Lori Marks, like Wendy said, and I founded an organization called Link Generation about 7 years ago now. And the mission is to educate young people about aging and connect young people with older adults in the community in interactive programs that benefit both populations, just like Wendy said. It's multi-generational. And it really came about from my own experience, which I guess a lot of these organizations do when you're really passionate about something from your childhood. I grew up in a household where my grandmother lived with our family. And she was invited to move in with us when I was, I guess, probably in about third grade, because my grandfather, her husband, died and she was alone. And she was actually my mother's mother. I've told this story before. It's really important to me, but she was actually my mother's mother. But my father is the one who invited her to come live with us because he grew up with his grandmother living in his household. And he thought that it was such a great experience and he wanted his kids to have that experience. And so I'm not even sure if my mom actually liked the idea at first. But anyway, we all went along with it, invited my grandmother to be with us, and it was wonderful. And then just a few years later, my father died way too young. And we were already set up to have this wonderful support system in our household to really help us through that tremendous loss. And I think that really set the stage for me to see how we really benefited. The kids having my grandmother around, she had a lot of siblings come to visit, kind of a center for this multi-generational household. And I think that I also saw, and I hope this is true, that it benefited my grandmother. She really had this renewed purpose when she was widowed at a pretty young age. I didn't realize how young she was until now. I'm in my 50s and she was in her early 60s. And that was really young to be alone. And so I think that was something that I just really benefited from and wanted to share that with other people in our society.
And it's interesting, too, because I know when we first spoke, I said, I grew up with my grandfather in the household, and I didn't even, it never dawned on me that people didn't have a grandparent in the household because he was such a central figure in what was going on. And I, absolutely adore the years that I lived with my grandfather in retrospect, right? So when you're living through it and you've got another adult in the household, you're kind of like, wait, there's another pair of eyes here. But it was really helpful to me, I think, now in retrospect and understanding why having that additional support was, more beneficial and a formative part of your years.
Exactly. And I had a similar experience, Wendy, where I didn't really think that it was so unusual, although most of my friends didn't have that kind of household at the time. But I still thought, and I think a lot of my friends really enjoyed meeting my grandmother too. So they kind of got to share in that experience. So,
Yeah, my friends would always ask if my grandfather was a pirate because he had a big scar on his stomach.
oh,
It was very funny. they'd be like, "Wait," he'd tell them, "Oh, I'm a pirate," and he'd pretend that he would live, and they would be like, "Wait, what?" And it turns out, no, he just had a surgery, and he's from another generation where medicine wasn't as advanced as it is now with these big
Right.
scars. But he was able to make, like, all these stories up that we didn't, and later in life when he passed, we ended up finding out all of these things about him, and we said it was almost like Forrest Gump. He'd lived, like, so many lives that you didn't know what was going on. So it
Yeah.
was always great stories and great memories. So I wanted to ask you, when you were thinking about, creating this organization and you were thinking about, this experience that you had with, where you saw it, the benefit in your life, how did you decide to then, kind of scale it for other people versus, just sitting on the idea and not doing anything with it?
Well, I think that kind of these things sort of evolve. And so, of course, now in hindsight, I can sort of see what I learned from those childhood experiences and put them together with what I'm doing now. But it was a journey. What I did first was I always had an appreciation for older adults. And so when I got to, and also family relationships, because that's what I was living. I mean, that's what we all were living. And so I went to college and studied psychology because I was interested in interpersonal relationships. And then from there, I went to graduate school and I wanted to study human development, lifespan development. And I didn't realize that there was this whole field called gerontology, which is the study of aging. And I think that a lot of young people, especially in middle school and high school, don't know. In fact, a lot of people of all ages don't know about that field. Even though we have this population that's aging and more people are in that older adult age range, but so there's a need for more people to know about that age span. So I went to college, I went to graduate school and studied aging and gerontology, but I always loved the lifespan development part of my studies. And what I noticed was that there were lots of developmental milestones that people who are in adolescence go through that are similar to what older people are going through. So you're not finished developing when you become a 20-year-old or a 25-year-old. It's lifespan. You're developing all the way throughout. And there are a lot of changes in how you view yourself, how you view the world, how you view independence. Young people are developing their identity and becoming more independent. Older people are also developing their identity and going through transition and maybe changing their independent status. So there are just a lot of overlap in the developmental milestones that I learned in my graduate program, my formal training. And I just always felt like it was important to connect young people with older people. And I think it was really because that's how I was raised, but also as I studied more and experienced more, I could see that, yeah, this really makes sense. It really works. We're all learning from each other and we can all support each other. So that's how I discovered this important field of intergenerational relationships or intergenerational communication. So, from graduate school, I became an educator in gerontology programs and in public health programs. And but I always knew that I wanted to connect the different generations. And I just kind of went along and life happened. I got married, I had a couple of children. So I needed to balance my work life. So I was teaching part-time, doing some research part-time. And then once my kids were more independent and on their own out of the house, I was like, okay, it's time for me to take all the education that I've practiced and put it to use in this new format. And so I still consider myself an educator. I still teach at University of Maryland Global Campus in gerontology. And I try to balance that with the work I do at Link Generations. I've had a lot of students do some volunteer work and internships with Link Generations. And so I'm really, I try to continue practicing what I'm teaching. So that's how I got there.
Oh, that's really interesting. So you kept going as, having a personal life, but your kids were maybe less sort of need of you and your time. But then when you were able to make that transition and you had this passion, you just kind of took it off of the side or wherever you had kind of had the idea and put it and moved it into the lane of, okay, let's start doing this. And, actually seeing now that it's a program and you have results and you have people who've gone through it. Is it, did you ever think you'd get here? Like, did you ever envision when you first started that you'd be where you are now?
Well, it's such a good question because I feel like I kind of went on a circuitous route to get here. Because one thing I didn't mention is I had a job for several years, which was vice president of education for a medical association, which is kind of not really. It was in the gastroenterology field, which starts with a G, but it's not gerontology. It's, so, but still learning a lot of skills about running, and that's how I learned really how to run a nonprofit, was working in that nonprofit. It was a large established nonprofit, and I learned so much from the people I worked with there, and how to apply that to my own, nonprofit adventure. But, when I look back at an essay that I wrote when I was applying to graduate school, so I guess I was like 22 years old when I was writing this essay. It was all about intergenerational connections and creating communities. I think at the time I was writing specifically about skilled nursing facilities and how we needed to bring young people, like have daycare for children in the same place. So now the field has grown so much. There are groups that are really focusing on what they called shared site intergenerational program. But I mean, this was a long time ago, like a really long time ago, that I wrote that essay about how I envisioned this. And then, it took a long time to get here. So I don't know if I envisioned exactly what I'm doing now, but it was certainly related to what I'm doing.
It's interesting how people have that early influence to help others or to do things, and they kind of thread like on their way down their journey, kind of thread the skills needed to get to where they are. But it sounds like you, like me, realized pretty early on that you wanted to help others, and this is kind of your sort of calling or passion to do this kind of work. What was that like for you in that time when you were kind of deciding maybe what career to take or what path to take? Why did you decide you wanted to dedicate your life to making an impact or just serving other people?
Oh, that's a big question. Because when you ask that question, Wendy, I'm not even sure like which sort of juncture, in my life is the time when I would make that decision. I do know that as young as grade school, I did have a calling that I wanted to be in the healthcare field. I thought I did. And the only thing I knew, my father, who I mentioned before, was a physician. He was a pediatrician. So really the only thing I knew was, okay, I'll be a doctor. But actually at that time period, I was told, no, you should be a nurse because you're a girl. I'm not really that old, but actually that was sort of the view, the popular view. And so, but I have a really strong mother, and she was way ahead of her time in being a strong role model. And she early on said to me, "Why would you be a nurse? You should be a doctor." Of course, this is nothing against nurses because I have so much respect for healthcare providers in all aspects and all roles, but felt like I should go on for my education and really, whatever I did, I should become very educated and do it. So I guess I had that influence early on too. And I tried to, I pre-med for a while, and that the only thing that I knew. But what I realized was there were so many other things that I could do to use this passion for wanting to help people. And so actually, I went through a lot of changes along the way. I was one of those people who went to college and tried probably like 10 different majors. I was a biology major. I was a French major. I don't speak a word of French. I was what else did I do? A math major. Um, you know, and then I eventually discovered psychology and loved it. And that was really the passion for me, the calling, which was learning about people and relationships and interpersonal communication.
That is so funny. And I think it's like shout out to those people who try out as many things as possible. Cause I think later on in life when for those of us like me who committed pretty early on, like this is the road and just sort of trudged down it. I mean, you didn't get as many experiences trying to figure out, what it was. And maybe those experiences would have been valuable or fun or something to
Yeah.
reflect on later.
Well, I think that that also really speaks to the whole idea of lifelong learning, which is really a big part of um, the values of linked generation, which is that we can continue learning and exploring as we go along. And so, and it's not always a formal education, but I feel like the skills that I learned in all of those different disciplines, I use, and I do also, I mean, even I'm a reader. I love to read and I love history, but I think I never got to the history class until my senior year of college. And I was like, oh, I should have majored in history. So I was even having these second thoughts. It was so exciting and fun. So even the skills that I've learned in all of those different aspects, I still apply to what I'm doing. And the people who are involved in Link Generation are all teaching us so much all the time because of their different experiences. And so I think it's a really exciting way for young people also to learn about different life courses and life that you can take. Because I think, like I said about my own experience, I kind of I had a really narrow view of what was available. And so I think by talking to more people who have had lifetimes of experience, young people really get exposed to more options and more opportunities that they might be interested in or develop their own passions from.
Yeah, and it is a really cool, I think, ability to learn from people's lived experience when you have that connection and the communication, like you mentioned, the ability to break down any barriers and provide like a safe space for those conversations to take place or for those relationships to be built between the participants. So I was just curious if you could talk more about like what are some of the outcomes that you've seen or what are some of the transformations that have happened for the people who have been part of your program.
Well, that's my favorite subject, to talk about some of the stories and the conversations that have taken place in our programs. So our programs are all conversation based. So we arrange groups into small groups so that there are we try to have at least two young people and two older people in each small group conversation because it's more comfortable for people. And we have lots of themes that we've tested to kind of guide the conversation, but sort of like our conversation today, we have questions to facilitate the discussion, but a lot of times we go off topic, and that's totally because it's all about uh, connecting and having the conversation. So, some of my favorite stories, one story that I recall was about friendship. So, we were talking about friendship, and there was a couple in the group that had been married for 66 years. I know. And the young people had the same face expression that you just had, Wendy, where they were like, oh my gosh, 66 years. One of the people, I think maybe she was in eighth grade. She said, my parents have been married for 20 years. And I thought that was a lot. So this couple had been married 66 years. And we asked them what was the secret to this long relationship. And they started talking, and it was so wonderful to hear them tell this story. It was almost like a he said, she said kind of story. So she said, well, first you have to love each other. Then he added, and then you need to make sure that you always think of the other person. And she said, you have to have good communication. And she said, um, you should never go to bed angry. And then he immediately said, you might have to stay up all night. And so it was just so funny and delightful. But what was also really interesting was then the young people started applying what they just heard to their own friendships and relationships. And this was actually a conversation that we were doing over Zoom. And so it was during the pandemic when people still couldn't really get together a lot in person. And so the young people talked about how it's so important to check in on your friends and have good communication, and especially check in on your friends when they're having a difficult time or if you know they're going through a hardship. And I just thought that was so wise from the eighth graders and the ninth graders to point that out. So that was something that I think was a really a memorable story that showed outcomes. Another one that was really fun was we had a gentleman who had worked in the Senate during his career, and he was retired for many years. And he told some of the young people that he advised them that when you go to work, you should always connect with people about your interests. So always have lunch, never eat lunch alone. Have lunch with somebody, talk about whatever you're interested in and find out what they're interested in. It can be sport, it can be the latest jokes, it can be what movies you've seen. Because that way, and this was the important thing, he said that way, when you know them, next time you have to try to get something done in the like a negotiation, you'll already relate to that person because you made that connection. So his advice that a lot of the young people remembered when I asked them what were some standout highlights, they said, never eat lunch alone. I thought that was pretty fun too. I have one more story that I want to tell you that was really impressive. During the pandemic, when we couldn't get together with people in person, we tried to have people write letters to each other. We did some Zoom. We tested our program on Zoom, which we have found we can still do, and we're still using that, even though we are getting back in person. So we had this one of our board members who is in her 80s was living alone in her apartment, and during the pandemic was very lonely and isolated, like a lot of us were. And she said that she would be one of the people to write letters to some of the youth. We had some high school students and college students who were looking for ways to reach out and connect, and they wanted to write letters. So we put this correspondence together with a high school student. She was a senior in high school, and it was, April of 2020. And she was basically not motivated to do any of her schoolwork, and she was failing her classes. And she was afraid she wasn't going to graduate. And so the board member wrote to her and said, "You're so close." She, like did a pep talk in the letter. "You're so close to graduating. Just get your work done and graduate. Don't worry about how well you're doing. Just finish it so that you graduate." Anyway, just to make a long story short, the student graduated. She invited or she sent a letter back to the board member saying that she graduated. And she went on to go to community college. And throughout the next year, she kept sending updates to the board member. On Valentine's Day, she sent her Valentine's Day card and said, "I'm getting all A's in my community college classes." And the next year, she sent her a letter and said, "I've graduated with my associate's degree and I'm going on to a 4-year degree." So the board member tells that story a lot because she felt like it saved her through really feeling isolated. She felt like she had a purpose, like she did something important. And her role in that was to kind of give that encouragement and that wisdom to just finish and keep going. So that was like a really I thought that was a really wonderful story that happened when we were feeling like, how are we going to keep going with this organization? And it really motivated us to keep going too.
Yeah, that's so cool. Those are great stories. I think the advice about networking and how to really know what people are genuinely interested in, so that when you call in for favors and then you need a friend, that's more of a friend than a foe. I think that's a
Exactly.
really wise advice, and I love the idea of just having that ability to offer a little bit of support, even if it's an informal like method, like you said, a Zoom or a letter or something like that. I think that connectivity of the introduction and what you're facilitating through just having people who can respond to that need, when there is someone who says, "Hey, I have this need," and being able to then fill it. I think that that's really awesome that you were able to create the vehicle for that. And I also love that these stories show you how it doesn't have to always look the same, like, that you can get the outcome, but whether it's through in-person conversations with the couple or through Zoom conversations with a group or even the letter writing. There's so many methods that you could use. So I was curious when you were first starting out and saying, okay, I want to turn this idea thing that I have into an actual program. How did you go from something that was just in your brain to have like all the ducks you needed in a row to be doing these kinds of transformations now?
Well, I did a lot of reading and research and networking on my own. So I talked with a lot of people who and through talking to people and having lunch with people, because at the time we could have lunch with people, I would meet other people. Like I would tell somebody about my idea and then they would say, "Oh, you should talk to such and such, or you should talk to someone else." And I, like I said, I did a lot of research. I'm an academic by training. So I read a lot of journal articles and I read a lot of resources um, from different people who are doing intergenerational, because there's a lot of really creative and some activities all over the place. And there are actually other groups right here in Montgomery County where I'm located who are also doing intergenerational pieces. But what I saw was that there were a lot of people who were working with older people and having them come in to schools or to young people's groups um, and mentoring or tutoring, which is all wonderful work. And there were also a lot of school, like elementary school projects where they would come and do a show, maybe at a nursing home or something like that, which is also really great. But what I didn't see was a lot going on in the middle school and high school. And like I said before, I really felt it was important to start um, helping that group become aware of gerontology and of the importance of working with older people. And so I kind of looked, saw that gap and decided that's where I want to focus. And I started with the education piece because I mentioned that I'm an educator. And so and since I teach gerontology at the college level, I was able to adapt my education to the middle school and high school level of and creating awareness. And so I'm going to try to net this out. My husband is always saying, "Net it out, Lori. You go on too long." But I ended up getting. Then I discovered that the students in Maryland, and I think other states too, now I'm discovering, have a requirement to do a community service. They need to get credit for that in middle school and high school. So I thought, oh, well, that's a great way to recruit students. And in order to do that, I went to the Montgomery County Public School Volunteer Center to find out how to be a provider. And I had to become a nonprofit. I said, okay, I'll be a nonprofit. And so here I am. What I've learned since then is that when you have such a passion for helping people and doing a work, work that has a strong mission, it makes sense to be a nonprofit because you're always. I think you've talked about this in some of your other discussions and programs where because then you're doing everything and you're raising your resources and funds so that you can then give back to that mission. So of course it makes sense, and I've learned that along the way. But that's how I made. Oh, so how did I make the program? Um, I just thought about my own knowledge of people in that age group, and I really felt like a small group interaction was going to be most comfortable for the middle school and high school students. And so tried it out, piloted it, it worked, and tried it in different venues as we needed to throughout the last few years, and did some evaluation work too to really show the data that it's actually working and show those outcomes. And so we've been able to do that, and here we are still doing that, like still, piloting new ways of doing it and documenting and collecting data and doing it. So
It's so interesting because when I hear you talk about it, you make it sound like such an easy, straightforward process, but then in the middle of it, you're like, "Oh, and then I just decided to be a nonprofit."
yeah,
That's
exactly.
so funny. I think when people are starting, they often don't know if they should be a business or a nonprofit because they aren't sure how to approach that. They are inherently passionate about something and intrinsically driven not for profit, even if they have to create a business, they're usually like, but the struggle is because I really don't, I'm not as passionate about the profit. I'm passionate about the transformation that I'm looking for. And I think that that question trips people up all the time.
Yes. And actually, one thing I haven't mentioned yet, but part of my process has been to learn how to run a business, which that was not what I studied in graduate school or college. And so, and how to run a nonprofit. So a lot of that, I've also talked with a lot of people about. So in my journey to network with people, a lot of those conversations have been not related to gerontology, but related to, filing a 990 and applying to the IRS to get your 501(c)(3) status and, all of that, how to write a grant. So, yeah, it hasn't really been straightforward, but I feel like I'm so, I am so, I mean, I just really love the connecting of the people who are involved that it just, the other things can be a little difficult, but I'm up for the challenge. I look at it as a challenge and I try to just get through it and also ask for help and ask people who do know there's so many people who know so much more than I do in all of these areas. And they're all people I've asked are so willing to help. And I think that's a really important lesson too, is asking for help and um, working together with other people who have the expertise. A plug for you, Wendy. So happy talking to you.
Yeah, no, it's cool. And that's why I think this the beauty of this podcast is to show people that there isn't always a linear way to do this, but you can, progress if you keep taking action. And I love that you said you showed up to so many conversations. Like you kept showing up and kept showing up, and then you would get another nugget or another piece and kind of go off and implement it and then come back and get more. And I think that that's a really great example of the idea of resilience and tenacity as a social entrepreneur that you do you, probably could have gone to business school, but you still might not have gotten the education that you needed to do what you're doing now. That's the
Right.
funny part. So it is kind of a learned, understanding of how to make an impact and how to deal with, funding and profit and all these other things that you're trying to do. And then, still, like you said, get to the outcomes, be able to have measurable change, being able to demonstrate that, and then they feed that back into the organization through your marketing and other methods. And that's really where I try to explain to people that's the sustainability of what you're doing. It's the putting the mechanisms in place, putting the infrastructure in place, and then seeing it get the results and using that information, like you said, to alter, adjust course as needed. So I think it's a really great example that you gave today of how that looks when you're building something with a really sustainable mindset from the beginning. And I know you didn't mention that word, but I'm going to interject it in to the conversation because I think you gave a really good example of that today. So I just wanted to applaud you for your work.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. And so I guess the other question that I had for you, as we're starting to wrap up is two things. So if you are looking for anything for the organization to grow or to be supported in any way, I'm curious what that looks like for you. And then the other question I had, which we should probably go to before, that'll be the last question. So you could be thinking about that one. But the first question I had for you before that is how do you maintain your well-being so you can continue to show up and serve all these people and make these wonderful connections between the different generations?
Well, I am so lucky that I have a very supportive family. I mentioned my husband before, who does tell me to net it out. He is he's just wonderful, and so because I have that strong relationship and partnership with him, I've been able to do this really to go out and start this, and so that's been fantastic. And I think I also mentioned that I have 2 kids who are also very supportive, and they're so supportive that they're both independently living on their own, and so they don't need me as much, which isn't really making me always happy, but it's wonderful that they are. And, but anyway, so I do a lot with my family. And I think I mentioned my mother also. So I have this multi-generational world around me in my personal life that is always a model. It's always reflecting what I'm doing with Link Generation, which I think helps sustain me. But I also do a lot on my own with my family. So my husband and I do a lot of biking and a lot of hiking. And depending on what the weather is, we'll go ski. We do a lot of activity, and my kids do too. And so that's a lot of fun. And the other thing I do when I'm inside, and the other thing we do is we are big baseball fans. And so there's a lot of watching of baseball, either in the stadium or at home on TV. And if we're at home on TV, I'm knitting while we're watching baseball. So I like creating things and I like doing something that's interesting. And so that's how I think that would be how I maintain my well-being the most.
Those
Um,
are wonderful hobbies, and I know
yeah.
that this Washington, D.C. area is fun. It's a fun place to watch baseball. It's a fun place to go hiking and outdoors and biking and all of the things you
Yeah.
mentioned, so
And
I love it.
it's nice because really you can really go outside most of the year. And one of my daughter's coaches used to say, "There's no bad weather, just inappropriate clothing." So I always think about that when I'm making sure I bundle up if we're going out and it's cold or rainy or something like that.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I know that's true. I've definitely been caught with the "It's too cold for what I'm wearing."
yeah,
Uh,
exactly.
Awesome. Well, I've been so excited to have you, and so I guess back to the final question, which was, what can people do to support what you're doing? And if, you would need to, direct them somewhere to connect to you, feel free to also give that information as well.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that opportunity to do that. And actually, what we're working on right now is our seventh annual celebration or event. And for the first 3 years, we did it around baseball. So in Bethesda is the Bethesda Big Train Baseball Stadium. And we're doing our event. We're going back to the ballpark after 3 years of being virtual for our gala celebration. And so we're doing a picnic and you can go to the baseball game. And we're actually having an author who wrote a book on her own intergenerational family experience. The book is called um, The Value of Wrinkles. Her name is Isabel Tom, and it's a great book. And she's going to be at the event signing the book. We're going to give it to people who buy tickets. And so I would love for anybody who's interested in learning more about Link Generation to join us at our event, or at least to go to our website, which is linkgenerations.org. And I'm happy to answer any questions. And my email is available too, which is Lori, Lori, at linkgenerations.org.
Awesome. Well, it's been so nice to have you. And thank you for telling us today about what you're doing with Link Generations and how, you can inspire other people to connect on all different levels throughout the lifespan to make sure that we're learning from each other. We're learning from each other's lived experience. So it's been wonderful to have you, Lori. Thank you for being here. And for everyone who's listened to this episode, thank you for listening and for watching and for hearing more about Lori's journey. I hope this has inspired you to turn your ideas into something that you can be really excited about, that can impact other people's lives and really make a difference, like Lori's example today. So thanks, Lori, for being here. Appreciate you.
Thank you for having me.
All right, everyone. This has been another episode of the Social Impact Level Up podcast. Stay tuned for another episode next week. Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Social Impact Level Up podcast. It's been awesome to interview today's guest, and I hope that you leave inspired to take action. If you're looking for any of the information we spoke about, it's probably down in the show notes. Make sure that you're checking them out and you're clicking on any of the links that seem exciting to you. If you are looking for a coach or a consultant to help you with your social impact or your sustainability, reach out to me via my website, hop on my email list, or jump into one of my programs. All of the links are below. So excited to have you as part of the collective. Make sure that you come back and join us for another episode next week.